I'd like to first thank everybody for being here this morning. I know talking taxes so early is a bit trying, but we really think this is an important and critical issue, and I want to thank everybody for being here bright and early. We have an absolutely stellar group of panelists here with us today who are going to impart all sorts of knowledge for this morning's panel session titled Texas's Brewing Property Tax Revolt. But before we get started, let me introduce myself. My name is James Quintero, and I'm the director of the Center for Local Governance at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. My colleague Jess Fields, who's right there in the back, say hello, Jess. Together, we help advise cities, counties, school districts, and special districts on good public policy. And so, speaking of good public policy, I know that many Texans are beginning to wonder about the efficacy of our current property tax system and whether or not there might not be some tweaks needed to our current system. And here, let me read off just a few reasons why people might be fed up with our current property tax system. According to the Tax Foundation's latest national rankings, the Lone Star State's local governments collected about $1,500 per person. And that was as of 2010, which ranks as the 15th highest nationally. So we have the 15th highest and most burdensome property tax collections in the nation. Now that figure is up from about $1,400 per capita in 2008 when the system ranked as the 17th most burdensome. So the burden is growing. Now that's on a per capita basis. What we see for the average homeowner is a little bit more exacerbated. These numbers here were culled from the American Community Survey, which is run by the Census Bureau. And as you can see, the average 3-year property tax paid by the average U.S. homeowner is about $2,000. You look at the South region, of which Texas is a part, and it's about $1,400. But if you, that figure for Texas is upwards of close to $2,500, and that's an average annual tax bill. So it's quite a substantial burden. But it's not just the burden that we're concerned with. We're also
the rate of increase. Can I predict you have a graph that shows the rate of increase is higher?
You are correct, Senator. Thank you.
Okay. That was, I didn't want to steal my speech, but I know you're okay.
So,
That's right.
So from 2010 to 2011, what we saw is that property tax levies increased by about 80%. Now you compare that to population and inflation, which increased by 53% over the same period, and you can see that the rate of growth is concerning. There's an accelerated rate of growth when it comes to property tax levies that begins to call into question whether or not homeowners and businesses can continue to pay these growing property tax bills. And of course, the financial burden created by Texas's current property tax system is just one component of the whole. There are other ills associated with the property tax, which include impediments to job creation, disincentives to property investment, and of course there's the fact that no Texan can ever truly own their own property, but merely rent it from the government. And so it's against that backdrop that I'd like to introduce our distinguished guest of panels today and ask them what, if anything, can and should be done about the current property tax system. And so with that said, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, who is funny, charming, very intelligent. He is the current state senator for SD 14, the former Austin mayor, He's the chair of the Senate Democratic Caucus and serves on Senate committees overseeing business and commerce, economic development, nominations, transportation, and he's the vice chair for the Senate Committee on Higher Education. A very brilliant man. Let me introduce, please help me welcome Senator Kirk Watson.
You want me to talk now? Man, that's going to be hard to live up to. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I apologize that I've got this goofy thing with me, but I left the house this morning and don't have any glasses, and I'm getting older. I mean, I'm blind, so I'm gonna put these on if you don't mind. And I feel goofy, but that's, y'all were expecting that, weren't you? So let me talk a little bit about, I think you're going to see a lot of agreement on the issue of property taxes as we get into this legislative session. And in my opinion, and I've written about this already, Texans deserve a refund, and they deserve some truth about how property taxes actually operate in our state. It just shouldn't be this frustrating to own a home in the state of Texas. We can't control our property values individually. I mean, we're paying taxes on something that we can't control the property values, but we have to pay the tax bill that's based on those values. And so what happens is we feel helpless when we see values increase and soar because we, for example, if you live in Austin, Texas, and in Central Texas, you live in a rapidly growing community, and, well, you live in a market economy where that thing called supply and demand, which, by the way, I may have just shown you all I know about the market economy, but that, by the way, would qualify me to be chair of the Senate Finance Committee. So I'm happy to serve if called upon. But here's the thing. At the very same time that's going on, we're having that frustration. We also care about our schools. We care about our parks. We care about the playgrounds. We care about our roads. We care about public safety and all of the infrastructure and things we need in life in order to live this close to one another. And we want to be able to afford to pay those kinds of things. So the question becomes, where's the balance? And how do we address those things? Well, I say the first thing we have to do is we need to be honest about the problem. And one of the things that I think is kind of refreshing as we go into this legislative session is that we're starting to see more of a discussion about it. The title is the Brewing Property Tax Revolt, but I would also tell you I think what you're seeing is brewing honesty about how we're dealing with property taxes. So let me make a categorical statement that I think is one of the first things. As they say, the first thing is recognizing you got a problem, right? The state of Texas relies too heavily on local property taxes. The state relies too heavily on local property taxes to pay for public education. Well over half of your property tax bill, as a general rule, goes to public education, which is the responsibility, public education is the responsibility of the Texas legislature, the state, according to the Texas Constitution. Not once in the past 30 years has the state paid a full half of the cost of public education, according to the LBB data going back to 1984. The legislature could reduce local property taxes if it owned up to its constitutional responsibility. And instead what happens, and politicians will be politicians, and it takes one to know one, so I'm willing to admit that out loud. But what happens is you hear railing against taxes, at the same time the state is quietly taking advantage of them and advantage of the growth in property values. In 2013, state budget writers banked on nearly $3 billion from local school property taxes to to cover a portion of Texas's obligation to school children. That amounted to 45% of the additional, okay, 45% of the additional so-called state funding in the 2014-15 budget used to pay for new students, instructional materials, and the restoration of some of the state budget cuts in school funding that were made in 2011. 45% of the so-called state funding was local property taxes. And by the way, it doesn't matter if your district is rich or poor in terms of the property rich versus property poor in that regard. The state takes from all of you if your property values are rising. That isn't Robin Hood, although the state taps billions in property taxes for that purpose too. All jurisdictions collected in an annual basis $45 billion. $45 billion. 55% of that was local school property taxes. And the state took a big chunk of those. So the state scoops up those local property taxes and then deflects the blame and points to local jurisdictions and says, we've got problems there. Now, on this panel, you've got two senators that you're going to hear us say a lot of things that sound a lot alike. There are going to be some things that we disagree on how we get there, but one of the things I'm actually looking forward to is to getting into a legislative session where this sort of honesty discussion is now occurring. And you can talk about how we get there. One of the areas that I disagree with Senator-elect Bettencourt on, and we're going to figure out how we get around that, is I want to focus on the state's responsibility for public education, and I think it's probably the old mayor in me that believes that in local control, we ought to let the local jurisdictions make the decisions about what they do, like cities and counties. And if the state's the one scooping up the money, then we ought to look at ourselves first and solve that part of the problem. And I'm hopeful that we'll have some discussion about that while we're here, having this discussion. And I know we'll have it during the session. And frankly, we've developed a good friendship already talking about some of these things. So how do we fix the problem? From my perspective, let me give you a couple of fixes, and I've already filed legislation to try to do this. First, and if you were here yesterday, one of the things you heard me talk about when we were talking about budget is I think we ought to increase the mandatory school homestead exemption to $25,000. In the state of Texas right now, there's a mandatory homestead exemption for school property taxes that's $15,000. That hadn't been changed since 1997. So, and just as a quick little bit of math, the average value of a home in Texas in 1997 was less than half of what it is today. So the power of that has gone away. I think we ought to do that. In the Austin Independent School District, that would provide a tax bill reduction of $120 for every homeowner, cutting in half the increase that was seen in this year on an average value home. I think we ought to link that exemption to inflation. We can ensure that it keeps its value that way over time, and we don't have to have this revolt or discussion once every 20 years. It should, what we ought to then do is the state's responsibility would be to make up that lost revenue. It would result in a loss of revenue since the state's so dependent upon local property taxes. Be about $1.3 billion for the 2-year budget. The state ought to come, that's real money, by the way. That is real money. But it's not as much as the $2 billion or more for increased local property taxes that the state budget writers are already counting on in order to make the 2016-2017 budget work. I've got a number of other ideas that relate to property taxes. I'm going to be out of time in less than a minute now. So what I'm going to tell you is things like making sure that we have transparency and fairness in the appraisal process, and we can talk about some of those if you have questions about it. The bottom line is, I think you're going to see in this next legislative session an agreement that something has to give. I think you're going to see agreement that the first step is to be honest about that we have a problem, and I think that was indicated also in the introduction. And the good news, in my view, is you have well-meaning people trying to figure out what the fix is. In my experience, that usually leads to something that brings about good legislation, and one of the reasons, frankly, I'm so hopeful about this next session of the legislature. So thank you all, and I'll turn it over. I think I stole your deal.
All right. Thank you, Senator. Appreciate it.
James, why don't you let him come on in? There's plenty of seats.
Yeah, folks. If folks, we have some seats over here in the back right corner. If you guys want to filter in.
Or right over
No.
here, come on in.
Are you going to get up here?
Yeah, no, I'll get up.
Who knew that property taxes were so popular? Especially it's early in the morning.
I just want to point out that Bettencourt hadn't even been sworn in yet, and he's pushing me off.
Well, if he hadn't agreed with me that we need some relief, I would.
Well, let me introduce our next panelist who needs very little introduction. He's the Senator-elect from SD7. He's also the CEO of Bettencourt Tax Advisors, LLC, and a KSEV radio personality and former Harris County tax collector and assessor, Senator-elect Paul Bettencourt.
And thanks so much. Since Senator Watson has been so gracious, I want to extend that to some of our new colleagues. I see Senator-elect Van Taylor, and also I saw Senator-elect Bob Hall somewhere here. Bob, where are you? Okay, this way, right. Okay, and I also see Senator Larry Taylor, too, as well. So you've got a lot of interest from the Senate in property taxes, because I believe we're going to do something about it. I think we're going to have property tax relief. The question is how much, and not whether we will, because there's a lot of consensus that there is a problem, just as Senator Watson has outlined. And if James could ever get the slide up, you can see exactly how much percent on a tax roll. Go to Midland, Odessa, you can find out double-digit increases. Eagle Ford Shale, lots of increases. And of course, as Senator Watson said, big increases, especially in the subdivisions you represent right south of the river. Big increases. So now, he's mentioned the other problem, which is as value. This is my corollary: as values go up, our rates don't go down. Okay, which is why I filed Senate Bill 182 to get the discussion started, because we need to be honest about what we're doing. Okay, we're just basically, we've got a whole bunch of people that love to hide behind the fact that they're not raising your taxes. Well, they are. They're not raising your rates, but your values are going through the roof, okay? And as an old tax assessor, I would tell this joke, and the people in Harris County, like Malcolm Morris, know this, okay? It's that you could pay off your banker after 30 years, but who could you never pay off? Your tax man, okay? And that's the same around the state, okay? Because taxation is at roughly a 3% number in the state, especially if you add in municipal utility districts. And you look at that. Now, my colleague is absolutely correct. The state has a problem with this that we have been not honest with the public about, and we're going to be honest with them, which is basically, it's, I'll call it Robin Hood recapture, which is as you pay more, the state pays less to school districts, okay? Now, Dick Lavine will be up and talking about why they need all the money, so I'll make sure not to tee him up too, okay? But the problem is, and you can see this with the graph that James put up, okay? When you look at the combined increase on local property taxes, there's only one period of time where it slowed down. What was that one period? Anybody want to help me? My House members, who tell me about it, okay? Everybody bought down the rate, okay? Bought down the rate big, Larry, because you were there, right, 50 cents. Now, that's what kicked that number down, okay? That's the only time that there's been a reduction. Now, my staff is here, and we've got some good data for you. That shift was about 6% that moved on, if you had 100 cents on the dollar, that buy down moved about 6 cents from from schools, okay, off, but it was replaced effectively by the cities, the counties, and the special districts all adding 2% to the load, just like that. So we have a problem with appraisal creep. Now, when you see what you come out to the end of this is that combined population and inflation is 53%, so we're growing 1.5 times faster than that market limit, but we're also growing probably 2 or more times faster than Texans' paychecks. That's not a rational public policy long term. So we have to slow that growth. And Senator Watson's talked about his bill, which is a great first start. I think we're gonna do better than that. How about doubling it? You said that the inflation.
If you can find the money otherwise, let's go.
It's just $1 billion. We can probably find it somewhere. His only cost $650 million.
Tax and spend.
I know, tax and spend. See, only in Texas can a refund be considered tax and spend. Now we have to talk about that someday too. The news for another panel. And I think also too that we should be sharing that with that relief with Texas businesses, because they don't get the advantage of an appraisal cap. They don't even get a circuit breaker. What you see in Texas business is almost a constant stream of double-digit increases, because how else do you get local property taxes up that high? Now, I think I heard a time bell. Okay? No? Okay. It was just somebody. Was it good call or?
I think
Yeah, that's right.
I think anytime Paul Bettencourt calls for tax relief, an angel gets its wings.
Now that was all right. Well, my senatorial colleague has gone to a new high in his eloquent presentation this morning.
That's what you heard.
That's right. Well, kind of hard to top that, but so we got one vote, man. See, that's good. We got one vote. Now, all right. So where do we go from here? Now, we've got a budget situation that has. Quite frankly, we need to be honest about that. We've got oil at 50 or less. Okay. Now, there was a time back in the summer that at oil at 107 billion, we probably had the money to wipe out the franchise tax and do a giant property tax cut of another 10 billion, and that would have added to 20 billion, which is what I made. If you look at a blog posting recently, I made a comment about that being a non-starter because we simply don't have 20 billion at this point in time. And I don't care whether you have 20 billion or just 2 billion, but applying it to property tax relief is very important to the state. We are capitally intensive. This does, it does have a big jobs impact long term. And more importantly, we just simply can't be taxing people out of their homes. I get a lot of calls, around this time of year because people pay their taxes. And when they pay those taxes, they have a real problem making ends meet. Even over 65 folks that have frozen values only have half their bill frozen in the urban areas. The other half is counties, cities, special districts, whatever. And those are generally not frozen. So we even put seniors at risk with this process. Now, and as an economic conservative, I know that these growth levels are too high, and we can do better with less. And that's what we're going to do, at least with the bills that we're talking about filing. If we double the homestead exemption, that is $1 billion of property tax relief to almost nearly 4.5 or higher of homeowners, million in the state. And more importantly, we need to look at business taxes, especially on inventories, because we're one of the few states, I think there's only half a dozen states left in the union that have a high taxation on business inventories. I'm not talking about fixtures and equipment. I'm just talking about what people make to try to make a living in this country, which is called manufacturing, okay? And we need to incentivize that, because when we lose jobs, and we will, okay? Right now, we're in this end of the bubble period, and oil has collapsed. And quite frankly, sadly, as long as King Abdullah is alive, I don't expect him to change his mind, okay? Because he's done this many times in the past decades of driving oil prices down and driving out marginal producers. We're going to have already, I've got people in my district, major manufacturers that are getting orders canceled. We're getting rigs shut in, and the next thing that will happen is we have layoffs. So we're in a business cycle environment. But what happens is even with the best effect of the legislature, we get to interrupt that circuit break or effectively one time. So that's why I think we need to slow the abilities of jurisdictions to raise taxes. Now, let me explain one last thing, which I do differ with Kirk on, but I'll get my pitch in here. One of the problems we got is because we don't tell the public the truth. We have some language called truth in taxation. It's gobbledygook. I mean, you see the notices in the paper. Nobody shows up at the hearings. No offense, Councilman, unless I'm wrong. Okay? All right? And it takes tax professionals to even understand what the message is in there. Okay? Right now, I've got jurisdictions because of the rollback rate being so high and the fact that you can add new construction and 41 other items into it, that their levies can go up 15, 16, 17% a year. Now, for those of you that were KSTV listeners in Houston, you know the rule of 72, which now Lieutenant Governor-elect Dan Patrick talked about, which is anything, if you add 10% to it for 7 years, say it, doubles. Thank you, Dale. I knew there's at least one Aggie in the audience who got that back at school. And more importantly, if you run up your levies, and for example, I've got a home rule city, Bunker Hill. They're above the rollback rate. They've got a 17% increase. It doesn't take very long to double that. In fact, you'll be doubling that in about 4 years as opposed to 7. Does government really need to grow that fast? Why does government need to grow on a local level at double digits by law anywhere they want to? Okay, especially a landlocked city that's not expanding. And that's why I went out and started the debate, because it's going to be a contentious one. But it needs to be, because that's really where truth in taxation is. The truth in taxation that people need is what they pay every year versus what they paid last year, and not a bunch of formulas in a newspaper that says show up at a hearing and we might talk about it. That's the type of truth in taxation we need, and that's what I'm going to do, is fight for that. For residences and commercial property owners all across the state. And I'm really happy that we've already had this type of turnout. You're right, taxes generally doesn't draw this heavy. And we'll talk about needs and wants next, because I know Dick will go on the one side here. But it's really important that we fix this problem. It's one of our competitiveness issues. It's one of our number one complaints from homeowners. And it's something that we do need to do something about it this year in the legislature. Thanks for your time.
A chartered financial analyst, chairman of the board of directors at the Travis Central Appraisal District, and he's a member of the executive board of AFSCME Texas Retirees. Please help me welcome Mr. Dick Lavine.
Hi, thank you, James. Thank you to TPPF for inviting me here. As you may know, CPPP, my organization, and TPPF are often paired together as one side or the other, but we do have a lot more in common. And I think I can point out some of the places where we do overlap, as well as some disagreements. I don't actually have anything prepared. I actually asked to be after the senators, not only because of their obvious seniority, but so that I could be a rebuttal witness. So really what I want to do is run through point by point some of the things that I agree with and disagree with, and also maybe lay out a few specifics so we can have some time to discuss them. And not being a senator, I hope I won't be taking quite as long as they did to.
Bettencourt showed his filibuster ability.
Well, with the hip replacement, I'm really not a candidate.
To stand up. But let me just start with the statistic that James was putting out, which was that we are 15th, he cited, in local per capita. Is that right? Per capita local property taxes. And that's the same number we come up with, 13th, 14th, 15th, because we're both using the same source. But he left out the other side, which is when we look at state taxes, Texas is always 46th, 47th, 48th. And those are related. There are services that need to be provided, police and fire and emergency services at the city and county level, and roads, as well as public education. And if the state's not going to pay for them and not help out the school districts and the local jurisdictions, then the local property tax payers are going to have to pay for it. Now, we want to provide these services in the most efficient way possible. We know better than most people that there's not enough to do what we think needs to be done. So we do not want to waste any dollars. But we do need these services, and we do need to make the investments in the long-term future of Texas prosperity. And if the state's not going to do it, local property tax payers are. And that's the real root of the problem. Now, let me just run through on the homestead exemption. I think a $25,000 homestead exemption or greater would be just fine. The advantage from our point of view of the homestead, of a flat dollar amount homestead exemption, is of course those people with the lower value homes who are probably the ones having the most trouble paying their property taxes get a larger relief. If you have a $100,000 home, $25,000 off that's going to help you out a lot more than somebody with $1 million home. $25,000 off won't help that much, but on the other hand, if you own $1 million home, you probably don't need the help that much. Just a little wrinkle though, instead of pegging the increase to inflation, why not peg it to the median value of the home, statewide or within the school district or the jurisdiction?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but that is part of, I said tying it that, we could tie it to either one of those.
All right.
Because that would make it better in different places.
Right, because, and this comes up, I don't want to get too far afield, but we're talking about population and inflation as a base against which to measure things, and I think you have that on one of your charts, James. Inflation, consumer inflation means nothing. It's includes things like your cable TV fee and your ATM fees. That's not what the state and local governments spend their money on. They spend their money on concrete, or they spend their money on health benefits for their employees, and those things tend to go up faster. So consumer inflation is really kind of irrelevant to any of these discussions. Now, let me also say that I'll agree with Senator Bettencourt that the real problem with property taxes, and this is what I hear when I go out speaking to local groups around Travis County about property taxes, is it's not linked to your ability to pay. Your property tax bill goes up whether or not your paycheck does. Again, I don't want to get too far afield, but there is a tax that is related to your ability to pay. But as long as we don't have that tax, we need to do something to at least make sure that the property tax is responsive to people's ability. But let me be clear that it's school districts, which are in fact more than half of school property taxes, already have essentially a zero rollback rate. In other words, for almost all school districts, once they hit $1.04, which 950 out of the 1,000 school districts already are, they need voter approval to raise that rate above that. So for school districts, which is the big property tax bill, we already have what is proposed as an overall solution. The other thing about school districts that I disagree, if I understood the way Senator Bettencourt was saying it, is school districts don't gain when property values go up. Cities, counties, et cetera do, and that's why they have the effective tax rate calculation. So when values go up, they have to start their calculations of the next year's tax rate at a lower tax rate that would be revenue neutral. School districts aren't like that. When their property values go up and their property tax collections go up, their state aid goes down. It's revenue neutral automatically for school districts. So you can't say that HISD is flooded with money. It may be flooded with local money, but the tide's going out for state money. And when they go into Chapter 41, in other words, they become officially a rich school district and subject to recapture under the Robin Hood rule, they're no worse off. That's true. Austin ISD's been Chapter 41 for some time. I didn't realize Houston ISD was that close. You're not worse off. You may have to share back because of the constitutional requirements that the Supreme Court has announced about equity in school finance, but you don't lose because of being Chapter 41. I'd like to talk just a bit about property taxes, and besides the lack of the link to ability to pay, the public needs confidence that everybody's paying their fair share. And there's a couple of specific reasons why people don't feel that way. One is the issue of commercial undervaluation. This is something that got a lot of attention last fall, and I expect will come up again. And it's a bit of a setup for Senator Watson because I think he just filed several bills relating to this. But the essential issue is anybody can read, say in the Austin Business Journal, about a downtown office tower selling for $60 million, even though the appraisal district only had it on the rolls for $30 million. Obviously not fair. That office tower is getting away paying half of what they should have. Now, as James mentioned, I'm chairman of the board of directors of the appraisal district, but we know that we have these properties on for less than the real market value, and there are several reasons why we're stuck with that. One is the ability of these property owners of large commercial properties to go to court and under what's called an equal and uniform provision, which is fine. We want taxes to be equal and uniform. But all they have to do is bring in some comparable properties and say, look, the median value of these properties is below what my value is. You should lower us. And of course, once you do that, the next guy comes in and lowers it, and down you go. And the reason that the appraisal districts can't do anything about this is a second provision, which is a loser pays provision. So that if a commercial property owner, or any property owner, but in fact, it's only worth it to commercial property owners to pay lawyers to go to court. If a commercial property owner goes in and gets the appraisal district's number knocked down even by $1, the appraisal district's on the hook for the attorney's fees for the property owner. Now, anybody who's dealt with juries knows that if you have one number here, one number there, they're going to pick a number in the middle. Very rarely does a plaintiff or defendant in a civil case win 100%. Or in other words, the appraisal districts know almost definitely if it goes all the way to trial, they're going to end up paying the attorney's fees for the other side. So what do? They settle. And the property owner knows they're going to have to settle, and they can drive a very hard bargain. So we had to do it at Travis Central Appraisal District is we asked for a 20% increase in our budget for next year. Nothing we wanted to do, especially, and nothing that the city and the county and the school district, which pay for the expenses of the appraisal district, really wanted to do, but they understood why we were doing it. We needed extra money so we could pay for experts, so we could pay for our own attorneys, so we could credibly say, we'll go to court with you and we'll fight these things so that we can set a baseline for some of these downtown buildings. And then once we get a good value on one of ththese buildings, then using our models, we can work from there. But it's costing taxpayers money for us to go to court. It's not necessary, and there are reforms that could be made on this. Let me just quickly do one more thing. It's really kind of mundane, but I think it makes a difference, which is, every spring you get your notice of appraised value, telling you what your value of your house was last year and what the appraisal district thinks it is this year. On that notice is something called your estimated taxes. That is fantasy, but that's the number people focus on. And when I went out speaking last spring, because people were a little upset about some of these appraisal values, they said, I got my tax bill. That wasn't their tax bill. That was step one in the process of setting the appraised value. Step two is when the city and the county and whoever set their tax rate. And then in the fall, people like Senator Bettencourt in his former job send out the tax bill. But the thing about the estimated taxes on your appraisal is they're based on last year's tax rates. Well, almost never is that going to be true because of the effective tax rate calculation. Now, maybe it may drop as much as Senator Bettencourt would like, but almost invariably, except for school districts, we're a whole separate issue, but for cities and counties, their nominal tax rate, just in dollars and cents, what the tax rate is almost definitely going to drop, which means that almost definitely that estimated tax bill is going to be greater than the final tax bill you get in the fall. Now, to my astonishment, I discovered that I actually am more like a senator than I thought, and I ran out of time.
Well, our next panelist is a first-timer here at Policy Orientation, but he brings a wealth of knowledge on local issues and property taxes being the local issue that they are. We thought he'd be a perfect fit. He is a current city councilman on the Arlington City Council. He is the chairman of the Convention and Visitors Bureau, and he co-founded Touchdown Arlington. Please help me welcome Arlington City Councilman Robert Rivera.
All right, good morning. It's great to be here in Austin. For someone from Arlington, which I'm from, to be in a room full of people, my assumption right off the bat is that you're here to discuss whether there was pass interference on the game on Sunday, and the answer is absolutely not. So glad that we can get that squared away right off the bat. So go Cowboys, and we're excited about a big win on this upcoming Sunday, God willing.
I think they'd rather know about the hug.
You know what? If all good mascots help win, and so we'll take it. We'll take it. All righty. So we're here to talk about something very important to us all here in the state, not only statewide but also locally, and that's the potential for tax reform, and fully agree that it's something that we do need. What I want to focus on today are the viewpoints of smaller communities, large and small across Texas, which make up our great state. Every year, and it was mentioned earlier, that there is heartburn whenever it comes time to pay property taxes. And from the elderly to those who have lost their jobs to those with limited income, they experience that. And they do reach out to their local elected officials and also obviously their statewide ones. And they're asking for relief. And that's something that is not and should not be ignored. And ultimately, what happens is that if you don't pay, then litigation is involved, and unfortunately, sometimes property is removed from those that have it and are unable to continue to pay those taxes. And so transparency in this process is good. And the discussion, I think we all are in agreement that it is something that we all know and understand that it's part of that process of moving forward and receiving the improvement that is needed statewide. In the process of your appraisals, every year you get your tax notice, and you know there's a lot of discrepancy as to how that dollar amount is set. You know, there's a lot of evaluation that is done, whether it's new construction value minus depreciation. You have property that's income producing. You also have comparable sales, and a lot of it is really left up to folks in rooms that are doing potential for funny math and doing things behind the scenes that our residents may not have the wherewithal or the desire to really get involved with. I know that each of you probably every year receive a letter from companies saying that they can help lower your property taxes for a price, for a fee. And those are things that are really unfortunate because in some cases folks are taken advantage of and they're preyed upon. From the city perspective, Senator Bettencourt is absolutely correct that the sales tax valuations can remain fluid and solid. For over a decade in Arlington, our tax rate has remained the same. 37% of the money that Arlington spends each year, approximately over the last 5 years, has remained at about 35%, meaning that property taxes that come into our city pay for about 37% of our general operating fund for all of Arlington. So if there is this potential reform that is being discussed, there's a lot of cities that will have questions. And I'll focus on cities and leave the other entities for a little bit later. But, economic development could potentially be hurt. I know a lot of cities, especially Arlington, will use tax incentives to lure companies to a community. And that would be potentially wiped away. Also, if you do look at the how, I know that a potential increase for sales tax statewide would be maybe a potential method. That definitely takes away local control. And that is something that I know I would have a lot of reservation about, as I know a lot of elected officials at the local level across our state would as well. And it would definitely make things harder for the small communities that have little to no retail income in terms of sales tax generation. A city like Arlington, we're very blessed to have a robust economy and could potentially weather a reduction, but that's something that we definitely would prefer not to do. businesses expect a certain level of services. So do our residents. And so if we as a community have to rely upon funding, then sales tax is part of that. And so if we no longer have that sales tax revenue coming into our city, that's a little over a third of our income. And where's it going to come from? And how are we going to be able to move forward and pass our annual budget with any degree of accuracy? And so again, there's a lot of questions that come from that. Another smaller concern is, on the very basic level, code enforcement. There's a lot of people that will reinvest in their home, paint the outside of the home, put up a new fence, do the things that would keep the code enforcement people away. And so for many of those folks that do that, they do that in hopes of a federal tax write-off because of the investment in their home. And that would potentially go away as well. The Texas Municipal League, which is an organization that our cities are all part of here in the state, I know would definitely weigh in on the issue. And so would the other entities across the state. We have our esteemed local, and again, I'm using a local word here as I'm a local person, but we have our Collin County Judge, Keith Self, is here, and so I know that he's here and he cares about our local perspectives, and so I know our counties would weigh in on this, our community colleges, our hospital districts, and so there's a lot more to this, and our schools. So we definitely do have a lot of question, but ultimately I know that our communities would come together and support what happens in Austin because we all are Texans and we all care about our state, and we all know that there is some level of degree of reform that is needed, but it will require a lot of detail, a lot of difficult discussion. But we are Texas, we are Texans, and we lead, and we can lead America on this issue. And I'm confident that we have the right folks in place to do that, but it takes everyone's involvement and perspective and ideas coming to the table. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be here and appreciate the opportunity to be part of such an esteemed panel, and just look forward to progress on this issue, and just look forward to greater things for our state. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here.
Well, I know we probably have a few questions out there, but before we get to audience Q&A, I'd like to see if any of the panelists have any questions for one another.
I've got a question for a couple people in the audience. Why don't we let them?
Okay, good.
We know what they want to talk about.
All right, excellent. Well, why don't we move to audience Q&A? I know we have a roving mic right here. Yes, sir.
Yes, I have a question. We've talked about this extraordinary rise in tax rate, which is forcing people out of their homes, but nobody talked about the fact that for every $1 sent to the taxing authority, you're taking another $10 off the balance sheet of every Texan's home because you're devaluing the home by a cap rate of the amount of tax you're putting on it as an annual fee to the government.
Malcolm, if on an income model, that's exactly true. Okay, all right, and to make it clear for me, I happen to know there's somebody in the audience that, that we go year by year and get a value of $500,000 on a piece of property. The appraisal district comes back and tries to make it $2.5 million, and every year we have to go back and do the same thing over and over like Groundhog Day. And the real problem is that people spend so much energy fighting their values. Because I'll tell you this, let me do a survey. Everybody in this room that knows what they paid for their home initially, raise your hand. All right? Everybody, it's an emotional connection. You know exactly what you paid for your home, okay? And you now know exactly where you are on this graph at this point. And Malcolm, it's obvious that when you look at general taxation rates at 3%, even with the 20% homestead exemption, which not every jurisdiction does, because the state, has quite frankly, made a mess of it when it comes to taxation. It's important that that even paying 2.4% every year on your home. Yeah, sorry. I couldn't remember your exact account from memory, Melanie. But paying 2.53%. Think about this. You're paying 2.53% on your home the rest of your life. You can pay your banker off, and you will never pay your tax man off. okay? And that's a real issue. And so I 100% agree with you.
In '89, it was 1%.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. In the front.
My first question I had at the start was the absence of any reference to no income tax, and just a presentation of just property taxes in a vacuum of other total Texas tax load. I thought was kind of a little weak. But my question is how do you gentlemen feel about the issue between the needs of the schools? I'd like to focus on the schools because they consume about half of the
Right.
budget.
Right.
They need more money. All levels of government typically need more money. They need more taxes, more revenue. Do any of your proposals or any of your negotiations, are they going to involve things that would pay attention to the Red Apple Project, which shows that 50% of the tax revenue that received by the schools goes to non-teachers?
Great point.
Yeah, and let me start with, and I hope I answer the question. I'm going to start first with one of the interesting points that you made about income tax. Get a little closer. Now, between the two of us, we're not going to be able to figure this out. So let's. Yeah. First of all, I had a bill when you mentioned income tax. Just as an aside, I had a bill. I think it was 2 sessions ago that would have created a circuit breaker on property taxes, so that because as we've all kind of referred to, you pay property taxes not on your ability to pay. And so my circuit breaker bill, what it would have done was it would have said that if your property taxes reach a percentage of your income, then there would be a circuit breaker and you might not have to pay. Actually, what my bill did was it asked for a study of that. It wasn't going to actually do it. It just wanted a study. That bill was vetoed, and it was vetoed specifically because that involved income, and therefore it was you couldn't even discuss it in the context of property taxes and the ability to pay. So I'll tell you that's why you don't hear a whole lot of talk about that. Is the ability to talk about it really doesn't mean anything. Well, it does change the discussion. Now, with regard to schools, it was implicit in what I was saying. Senator-elect Bettencourt made it more explicit when what he said was that we've got our system set up. When I call for honesty in how the state budget writers, we ought to all be looking in the mirror and pointing to ourselves when we tell you there's a property tax problem. Because part of what happens is the formula is set up, and Paul mentioned this, the formula is set up so that if property values go up and more money comes into the local property tax coffers, as Dick pointed out, and it puts money into those local schools, then the state's obligation decreases. So the state has a contradictory point of view when it says we want to give you some sort of property tax relief because it is relying upon that to meet its own obligation. So, for example, this bump he talked about that Paul pointed out, he's exactly right. And he asked the question and people in the room knew about it, Senator Taylor and others that were involved in that. What happened in 2006 was the Texas Supreme Court had said that the school property tax system, finance system, let me say that differently. The school finance system was unconstitutional. And by the way, that was not a partisan thing. It was an all-Republican Texas Supreme Court that said your school finance system is unconstitutional. The legislature came into a special session and it reduced local property taxes by about a third, from $1.50 per $100 valuation to $1 per $100 valuation. Thus, if you understand the system, creating a big hole in our school finances. So what the legislature did at the time was it said, what we'll do is we'll raise the cigarette tax a little bit. We'll create the liar's affidavit, so when you buy a used car, you really got to pay sales tax on what you really bought it for.
And I had to implement that as a tax assessor. So.
Yeah, well, there you go. So you have that, but then the real thing was the margins tax. And the margins tax was supposed to be what filled in that gap. The comptroller at the time said, you ain't filling in that gap. This gets to your point about money for the schools. You're not filling in that gap. That's not going to fill the gap. She was right. Now, what the legislature did, again, in my view, not being entirely candid, is it said, here's what we'll do. We've just put a hole in the budget. The carpet we'll put over that hole, we'll call this fund that we'll set up for the next session, for the 2007 session, and it'll be called the Property Tax Relief Fund. Really neat name. And it did plug that hole the next session. Then we got to 2009. You know, what do we do? Well, the federal government, through stimulus money, covered that. Then we got to 2011, and there were no more of those funds available. So what happened was, in part, and you also had economic issues, a big cut in schools that has still not been completely restored. The point of me pointing all that out is that as we talk about property tax relief, the state is going to have to be honest about where you fill the hole and how much we want to spend on schools and how we go about that. And here's the thing. We're going to go into this legislative session and we're going to put on some blinders. And I think we're all going to do it. Politicians are going to be politicians, as I pointed out. And that school finance lawsuit that's looming out there, a state district court has held that our school finance system is unconstitutional. It's on appeal to the Texas Supreme Court. That, I said it yesterday, that's going to get set over in the corner. We're not going to deal with that. And what that means is some of the, we could really be setting ourselves up if what we do is we're not careful on what we do with property tax relief. And you hear me, I'm filing bills bringing you property tax relief. But if we're not careful and we don't put it in context, we may be back at a point in time where we're going to have to really do something different that's not going to make people happy. So you ask a very good question. The context of this is really important.
The middle class in Texas is much bigger and much more prosperous than California. One. Number two, it wasn't Proposition 13 that did it. It was state-run education, and that came independently of Prop 13. Just want to clear that.
One thing I might add to this discussion, just as you watch the legislative session, and when you talk about the issues of progressivity and that kind of thing, one of the problems that, and I think Senator-elect Bettencourt and I agree, is when you look at cities and counties and what they can do with homestead exemptions to allow people to get a break on their property taxes, one of the problems is that for cities and counties, unlike the school mandatory exemption, which is a set amount, you can only do a percentage up to $20,000 or $5,000 minimum. I'm sorry, up to 20%, 20% or $5,000 minimum. And so what you see is in some places, people react negatively to that on a progressivity idea, but they also, it ends up impacting their resources so much. So one of the bills that we're filing is one that creates more tools for local communities to do those kinds of exemptions, including allowing them to do a flat amount. Now, my hope is that what that will do is it will encourage counties and cities to do more of it. The other thing that I think we agree on is that sometimes we want them to pay a little more attention to it. And so part of what we're going to do in one of our bills is it would require, if you're not going to have an exemption, we're going to require an affirmative vote of the local communities. They still have the local control, but the commissioner's court or the city council ought to have to take that issue up and make a decision and explain why they are or are not going to do something like that, to try to help with some of those.
Right, and you could add real quickly to that, that's what should happen instead of what happens in, quote, truth and taxation. Everybody should have a meeting where they take a public vote and they just put it on the table and say, we're raising your tax levies by 5.6%. And we don't do that in Texas. That's a mistake. And I want to point out that because I will say this, I've debated Dick for what's very long time. I knew that if he had money, he would spend it wisely, but I know that the people that he's talking about don't spend the money wisely all the time. And so as an economic conservative, I would put everybody under a hard revenue cap, which we've done in the city of Houston, which is inflation and population, less emergency expenses. And that would be my type of thinking, because otherwise government will just spend the money. They don't view it. There's no incentive for people not to spend the extra money that they get in. Now, one last thing. There's going to be an issue that Dick talked about, which I think it was Texans for Real Value, so I have the right name. Yeah, and they're talking about the fact that commercial values are terribly undervalued. Well, in Houston, I want to tell you what's happened to our 33 downtown buildings. In 2 years, the first year, the value was raised by the appraisal district 52%, and they got 5% off. The second year was raised another 19, and they got 1% off. They're now up 71% in 2 years, and people are looking to move out of downtown buildings because they're after $8, $9, $10 a square foot, they're getting taxed out. I know Kirk's got a study here in Austin. It may not be the same, but I've got a chief appraiser that has dropped the hammer. And so what was a view that all commercial property and the evil property taxpayers were not paying their share. Think about your building that you're having to do leases. You're up 71% on your number one controllable expense in 2 years. That's enough. And those court cases haven't even gone to trial yet.
All right.